friends. As soon as I regained consciousness, I wanted to get out of bed, but I couldn't manage it at all. It felt like something was holding me down to the bed. I was completely unable to move any part of my body. I felt utterly disabled. I kept trying over and over, but to no avail. I couldn't move my body at all, not my hands, nor my legs. Every part of my body was in the same condition. I wanted to open my eyes to see my situation, but I couldn't do that either. It felt as if someone had placed a tremendous weight on my eyes, under which I couldn't even twitch them. After struggling for a long time, I gave up. Tears rolled down from my eyes, trickling into my ears and onto the pillow. I didn't understand why I was in such a state, unable to move any part of my body. I couldn't even remember who I was. I tried to jog my brain, but nothing came to mind. Suddenly, I heard the door open. Hearing someone's footsteps, I realized they were approaching me step by step. I wanted to see them, to call out to them, but I couldn't manage to do either. How I wished at least one of my fingers worked. Tears were the only thing I could manage. Then, I heard someone shouting. Someone was saying, "Doctor, come here, look. The patient is crying." With those words, there was suddenly a flurry of activity around me. I could feel the presence of many people. Someone came to check on me, checking my heartbeat. It felt like someone was injecting something into my hand, and with that, my body felt heavier, and I lost consciousness again. When I regained consciousness the second time, the room was silent. Suddenly, I felt a touch on my head. Someone was caressing my head, saying, "Doctor, what happened today should not have happened. We need to stop it immediately. We are lucky the nurse had already informed us. If he had regained his senses, it would have been disastrous. We could have lost our jobs, and our reputations would have been ruined. We need to be more careful now." Do you understand why his tears are significant? I told you to watch over it. Yet, you paid no heed to my words. Your negligence today forced us to face such a day. I didn't expect this from you, but what can we do now? From now on, you need to check on him every hour. I will not tolerate any negligence or laxity on your part anymore. And first, change that nurse and adjust her duties. Like today, she almost caused an uproar in the entire hospital. She cannot be trusted. She might speak out in front of anyone. Make arrangements to keep her quiet. Do whatever it takes, even if it means killing her. And if you can silence her with money, then pay her enough to live on for the rest of her life. And never, ever let what happened today come to light. We barely escaped a disaster today. If we had been any later, much could have happened. And you well understand that it would not have been fortunate for us. The first person stopped speaking. The second one added, "Yes, no one knows better than me how disastrous the consequences could have been. You don't need to worry about it anymore. I'll handle this, and I'll take care of this nurse now. After today, she won't even be seen near this cabin, let alone in the hospital." With that, they both left the scene. I couldn't understand if these people were my friends or enemies. Why weren't they letting me regain consciousness, even though I could hear everything? Yet I couldn't move my body. If they were my enemies, why were they taking care of me? Why were they treating me? I couldn't make heads or tails of their actions. All I wanted was to somehow open my eyes, but I couldn't manage it at all. I didn't know how much time had passed when the door opened again. I heard someone's footsteps approaching me. Someone came and began to wash my face and hands with a wet cloth, wondering aloud, how can such a good-looking person have such bad luck? Have you ever heard of anything like this? He has been in a coma for the past 12 years. Hearing this, I was shocked. I had been in a coma for 12 years. Had I just been lying motionless on this bed all this time? My breathing started to accelerate. It was becoming difficult to breathe. The nurse seemed surprised to see my distress and must have called someone because, shortly afterward, I felt someone else by my side, giving instructions to the nurse and checking on me. Soon I was given another injection, and once again, I lost consciousness. When I came to again, I still couldn't open my eyes. I desperately wanted to see who these people were, who even after I was recovering, wouldn't let me recover fully. They kept giving me injections to knock me out again. Why was I continuously losing consciousness? And why was I in the hospital? What had happened to me? What had happened that I ended up in a coma? Despite trying hard, I couldn't remember anything. I could hear two people talking nearby. They seemed worried about my health. What had I done that made them so fearful of me regaining consciousness? They wouldn't let me come to, even after my recovery. What obligation did they have that compelled them to keep me unconscious? And why was the doctor complicit? Instead of helping me recover, he wanted to keep me unconscious and in a coma, while a doctor's job is to treat the sick and make them better. But here, he was doing the opposite. They discussed various things for a long time but didn't know I could hear everything, because they didn't realize that I had regained my consciousness long ago. I would wait for them to come and talk, and by listening to them, I hoped to learn something about myself. This was the only way I could find out my identity. I decided not to move or show any signs of consciousness in front of anyone, because I had realized that doing so would not benefit me. On the contrary, it would harm me. If they had even the slightest suspicion that I was conscious, they would give me another injection to knock me out, whereas I wanted to stay conscious as long as possible. Except for these two people and the nurse, no one else came into my room. I was no longer afraid of these people because I knew they wouldn't kill me. If they wanted to kill me, they could have done so during all these years. They wouldn't have kept me in a coma. A lethal injection would have been sufficient for that. There must be a reason they needed me alive, and I had to find out what it was. I also needed to find out my own identity. One day, while lying in bed, I tried to move when someone entered the cabin loudly, accompanied by the previous two individuals. The new person was shouting, asking, "What am I hearing? Is his condition improving? How is that possible? How could the medicine I suggested be working? And what are you doing here? Don't you know what could happen if he regains consciousness?" I heard that tears were falling from his eyes the other day. I've told people to keep me updated about his condition at every step. Why wasn't I informed? The man's anger did not subside. One of the first two replied, "It's not what you think." No tears fell from his eyes. It was a saline solution leaking, which the nurse mistakenly thought was tears. If there had been any truth to it, I would have informed you myself. The news of his recovery is entirely false. He has not improved at all. He is still the same, like a living corpse, only breathing. And that too, by our grace. I was quite taken aback by that man's words because he was lying. Suddenly, I felt a strong hand gripping my throat tightly. Someone was squeezing my neck, speaking in a voice filled with hatred. I immediately recognized the voice, and at that moment, all my old memories came flooding back. Each moment of my life flashed before my eyes. In an instant, I opened my eyes and pushed the man exerting force on me away. Seeing me suddenly open my eyes and react, the three people present in the room were quite astonished. I knew those three very well. By then, my body had started to function again. I suddenly sat up, and doing so caused a sharp pain throughout my body. But I ignored it and remained seated. The two men glanced at me, then went over to help the person I had just pushed down. The man on the floor looked up at me with frightened eyes, then suddenly got up and left the room. The other two also left the room immediately. But I had seen and recognized all of them. I could no longer let them go. I had once trusted this man, and that great mistake had led to my current condition. The entire hospital was now in chaos. My name is Samia Mumtaz. I am 39 years old. I was born and raised in a wealthy family. My father was a millionaire. We owned a private hospital in the city where we offered free medical treatment to patients. My father was an extremely kind and righteous man. He served people without any selfish motives. Despite his wealth, I never saw him act arrogantly about his possessions. He was a man of clear conscience and generosity. Our hospital was famous throughout the city. Anyone who met my father remembered him for a lifetime. At the age of 25, he married my mother, who came from a poor family. My grandfather had already passed away, and my grandmother was in the final stages of cancer at that time. My mother used to bring her to our hospital for treatment. My father was well aware of their situation, how my mother and grandmother were evicted from their home after my grandfather's death. A neighbor, moved by their plight and my grandmother's illness, had given them shelter in her home. However, the neighbor's mother-in-law was very troublesome. Besides medical help, my father also provided them financial assistance. He often suggested that my mother and grandmother should rent a place on their own, offering to pay the rent, but they never agreed. They felt safe in that house, thinking it would be a secure place for my mother if anything happened to my grandmother. But he did not know the true nature of the hardships my mother endured in that house. One day, my mother came to the hospital with my grandmother, who was then in her final days. That day, my grandmother pleaded with my father to marry my mother, realizing that her time was almost over, and revealing the true hardships of the household they were in. Wanting to make everyone happy, my father agreed, honoring my grandmother as he would his own mother, seeing in her the reflection of his mother. To make my grandmother happy, he married my mother. She peacefully embraced death, knowing her daughter was in safe hands. My father kept his promise to my grandmother and brought my mother home, introducing her with great honor to his family. He never let my mother feel that she was from a poor family or a different background. They started living a happy life together. 4 years later, in the joy of their home, I was born. My father named me. He wanted me to become a compassionate doctor like him and take care of the hospital after him. From childhood, he dreamt of me becoming a doctor, often speaking of a life in medicine. My mother had different ideas for me. She wanted me to own a farm, but I had no such desire. My father would tell her that I would be a doctor like him, and that her wishes could be fulfilled with another child. However, years passed, and no other siblings came. When I was 11, my mother suddenly passed away, leaving my father and me alone. I could not accept her departure. My mental and physical health began to deteriorate, eventually leading to my hospitalization for 2 months. I couldn't accept that my mother was gone, and my father was also deeply affected, although he tried to stay strong for me. Seeing my condition worsen, someone suggested that my father remarry. He did not want to remarry initially, but considering my health, he decided to go through with it. It was not difficult for a kind and wealthy man like my father to find a woman, but he wanted someone sensible who would take care of me, understand me, and provide the motherly love I needed. After much thought, he married a widow with a 15-year-old son. My stepmother and stepbrother were both good people. My stepmother took great care of me and loved me deeply. I quickly bonded with her, but I could never remove my biological mother from my heart. I was working to fulfill my father's dream. After completing my medical studies, I started working at the hospital. My brother also wanted to join this sector, inspired by me, but he was somewhat academically weak. Therefore, my father suggested, "You should study software engineering instead. It will be better for you. Being a well-known doctor, he had good connections. He told my brother, "I have arranged your admission at a prestigious university abroad. Your flight is next week." My brother's face changed upon hearing this. He never wanted to go abroad, but our father didn't consider his reluctance because he wanted him to succeed in life. He also wanted to get him out of the poor educational standards in our country. Meanwhile, my mother was unhappy with this decision. She never agreed to send my brother abroad. My father explained that all this was for my brother's betterment, to ensure he completes his education and stands on his own, as he wouldn't find a good job given his current capabilities. My mother objected again, saying, "What's the need for him to work? All this wealth is his. He can live off it for the rest of his life without working." Despite my mother's resistance, my father remained firm in his decision and ensured that nothing was lacking in my brother's education through his connections. Time passed in this way. One day, unexpectedly, my father called a lawyer home in the evening. I had just returned from my hospital duty and found my mother pacing worriedly around the house. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing much. I'm just worried because my son hasn't called for a few days." I assured her not to worry and said I would speak to my father so she could talk to my brother. I asked where my father was, and she said he was in the study room. As I approached the room, I saw the lawyer leaving. I asked my father, "What's all this, Dad? Why did you call a lawyer?" He then revealed that he had transferred the hospital's ownership to me. "From today, you are in charge of the hospital," he said, handing me a file. "Son, I built this hospital with a lot of effort. It was my dream. I worked hard on it, although your grandfather helped me a lot. But still, a lot of my hard work is in it, and I want you to work hard for this hospital after me. I have kept this hospital like my child, never letting it come to harm. I trust you will manage it with sincerity and care for my legacy. And from today, this house and some land and our family business, I have transferred to your stepbrother's name. I hope you have no objections to this." Smiling softly, I kissed his hand and said, "Dad, I'm still very young. I can't manage all this alone." He replied, "I'm here with you." I felt very happy, not because he had transferred the hospital to me, but because he considered me capable enough to manage it. I promised him that I would never let him down, but I had no idea what was to come in the following days. Within 2 months of taking on the responsibility of the hospital, unethical practices began to emerge. Complaints started coming in from all sides. I couldn't understand what was happening. My father became displeased with me due to the complaints against the hospital, ranging from counterfeit medications to excessive fees, although I had never charged anyone since I was running it for free as my father had. What was going on? I couldn't find any answers. Meanwhile, my father had a mild heart attack and became so distant in his disappointment that I couldn't bring him back. He passed away, leaving me feeling incredibly isolated. During this difficult time, my stepmother supported me, and she brought my brother back from America. He suggested I take a break from the hospital, considering its poor condition and my health. His logic was sound, but I couldn't just abandon the hospital. Then my brother offered to look after it for a while. I accepted this offer, thinking it was out of love. But I didn't know the mess he was actually creating. Once I felt a bit better, I decided to go to the hospital, but my mother and brother strongly advised against it. They wanted me to stay home and focus on my health. We stayed home thinking it was out of their love, but I didn't know they were conspiring against me. Every time I tried to visit the hospital, they stopped me, and I began to suspect something was wrong. Then, one day, a call from a doctor at the hospital confirmed my suspicions. So, one night, I pretended to be asleep at home and sneaked out to the hospital. When I arrived, what I saw made the ground fall from under my feet. The hospital, which was in my father's name, now prominently displayed my brother's name. My father's photo had been removed, and my stepbrother's photo was hanging there. Everything inside the hospital had changed. The prices for drugs, tests, and treatments had skyrocketed. Even a basic checkup started costing thousands. Dizzy from these revelations, I went to the reception to ask for my brother. I was headed towards his cabin, thinking to confront him, but I stopped outside when I heard noises from within. It felt like the sky had fallen over my head. Quickly, I pulled out my phone, sent a message to the lawyer, and burst into the cabin. Seeing me, my stepmother and brother's faces fell. They had been caught red-handed. There was nothing left for them to say. My brother, without trying to explain anything, struck my head violently with something heavy. My head burst open and blood began to flow. Everything before my eyes turned dark. I collapsed right there and lost consciousness. 12 years later, my consciousness has returned. All this had been done by my stepmother and brother for the sake of property, even though my father had written his business over to my brother. But he also wanted this hospital because, in his eyes, a private hospital was nothing but a profitable business. That's why he wanted to run it with expensive medicines, costly tests, and high fees. However, when he found out that my father had written the hospital over in my name, he lost his mind. He had assumed that everything would be his after our father. He planned to manage everything his way. But upon hearing that the property was to be divided, he returned from America and started engaging in unethical activities at the hospital. He wanted to belittle me in my father's eyes, to prove that I was unfit to manage the hospital so that it would be handed over to him. He was quite successful in his endeavors until he was finally caught by our father. That's why he killed our father. He would have killed me too that day. But having heard of my will, he was forced to keep me alive. Before entering the cabin, I had overheard that after hearing about my brother's deeds, our father had transferred everything to my name. Standing outside the cabin, I messaged my lawyer saying that if something happened to me or if I died, all my property should be donated in the name of the hospital. Because of this will, my stepbrother had to keep me alive like a living corpse for so many years. He lived comfortably under the guise of my illness. Seeing that I had regained consciousness, he fled in fear. However, the police arrived in time and sealed the hospital. They later arrested him. The hospital was full of counterfeit drugs. The hospital remained closed for a month. Afterward, I made changes throughout the hospital. I rebuilt it just as my father had wanted. 4 years have passed since the incident. My brother is still in jail, and I don't know where my stepmother has gone. My hospital still provides free medical services to patients,